The first-class cabin was nearly full when he stepped inside. Dressed in a simple but well-fitted suit, he carried only a single leather bag. He moved without urgency, his expression calm, as if nothing in the world could rattle him. Passengers were settling into their plush seats, some sipping champagne, others tapping away on their laptops. A flight attendant, young and impeccably groomed, scanned the cabin with practiced efficiency. The moment her eyes landed on him, something shifted in her face, a flicker of judgment. She watched as he made his way toward a prime first-class seat, a window spot with extra legroom. Her brows knitted together. Then, just as he placed his bag in the overhead compartment, she stepped forward sharply. "Sir," she said, her voice clipped. "This section is for first-class passengers only." A hush spread around them. A few passengers glanced up from their seats, their curiosity piqued. The man turned his head slowly, his eyes meeting hers with quiet intensity. He didn't respond, at least, not immediately. The flight attendant crossed her arms. "May I see your ticket, please?" she pressed, her tone laced with suspicion. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a sleek black ticket, the kind issued exclusively to premium members and elite flyers. He held it up, but instead of taking it, she merely glanced at it before scoffing. "That can't be right," she muttered under her breath. Then, louder, she added, "Sir, did you purchase this seat?" More heads turned now. A businessman nearby smirked, amused. A woman in the next row shifted uncomfortably. A sense of unease crept into the cabin. The man still hadn't spoken. He simply tilted his head slightly, as if observing something far more interesting than her words. The flight attendant's patience thinned. "I don't mean to be rude, sir, but we've had incidents before, people sneaking into first class." She flashed a fake smile. "I'm sure it's just a mistake. Maybe you're in business class?" A quiet chuckle rippled from one of the passengers. A few exchanged knowing glances. Everyone had seen situations like this before. A well-dressed person gets mistaken for someone of lesser status, and suddenly, assumptions take over. Still, the man said nothing. The flight attendant's frustration grew. She was certain she was right, there was no way this man belonged here. First class was for CEOs, celebrities, and the ultra-rich. But before she could push further, a senior flight attendant arrived, alerted by the growing tension. She took one look at the man's ticket and visibly stiffened. A flash of recognition crossed her face. She knew exactly who he was. The younger flight attendant remained oblivious, still convinced she had caught an imposter. The man's lips curled into the faintest smile, one that only the senior attendant noticed. But he said nothing. Because the real game was just beginning. The tension in the first-class cabin thickened. The younger flight attendant still had her arms crossed, her lips pressed together in barely concealed impatience. The senior attendant, however, looked as though she had swallowed a stone. For a moment, there was only silence, thick, stretching, uncomfortable. Then the senior flight attendant cleared her throat. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, her voice carefully measured. The younger one turned, her confidence unwavering. "This gentleman seems to have mistaken his seat assignment," she said, emphasizing the word gentleman as if it was somehow questionable. "He presented a first-class ticket, but I'm sure there's been an error. Maybe he was upgraded by accident?" The senior attendant's eyes darted to the CEO, because that's exactly who he was, though the younger one had no idea. The man's expression remained unreadable. He simply leaned back in his seat, resting his elbow on the armrest, his fingers lightly touching his chin as though he were observing a social experiment. The senior attendant hesitated, debating whether to intervene or let the scene unfold further. She glanced at the captain, who had also been silently watching from the entrance of the cockpit. His brows were raised, but he, too, said nothing. The younger flight attendant misread the silence as support for her actions. Emboldened, she sighed dramatically and shook her head. "Sir, I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to move to your correct seat. First class is reserved for paying passengers, and we can't have people sneaking in." The words landed with a dull thud. Passengers shifted uncomfortably. A man in a tailored navy suit smirked, clearly enjoying the show. A woman near the aisle lowered her magazine, watching closely. The CEO remained completely unbothered. Still, he did not move. And he did not speak. Instead, he slowly reached for his boarding pass, the same one he had already shown, and handed it directly to the senior flight attendant. She took it with slightly trembling hands. Her eyes flitted over the name printed in bold letters. And she paled instantly. The captain took a slow step forward, peering over her shoulder at the ticket. His reaction was more controlled, but his fingers curled slightly at his sides, a sign of his own surprise. The younger flight attendant remained oblivious, watching the silent exchange with impatience. "Well?" she demanded. "I assume that settles it? He should be moved, right?" The senior attendant swallowed hard. The CEO finally spoke. His voice was calm, smooth, dangerously quiet. "Tell me," he said, tilting his head slightly. "Would you have spoken to me this way if I were wearing a tailored suit?" The question was a slap in the face. The flight attendant blinked rapidly, caught off guard for the first time. "Excuse me?" The CEO's lips barely moved. "Would you have doubted my place in first class if I looked different?" A thick silence followed. Passengers watched, waiting. Some knew exactly where this was heading. Others were still piecing it together. The younger flight attendant's jaw tightened. "Sir, it's standard procedure to check tickets, is it?" The CEO's voice remained unshaken, controlled. "Did you check anyone else's ticket?" The color drained from her face. She hadn't. Because she had assumed. And now, she was seconds away from discovering just how big her mistake was. The senior flight attendant exchanged a look with the captain, silently asking for guidance. But the CEO wasn't done yet. He reached into his inside jacket pocket and pulled out something that made the senior flight attendant grip the nearest seat for balance. A black leather ID case. The younger flight attendant squinted at it, confused, until he flipped it open. Her breath hitched in her throat. Passengers craned their necks, trying to see. The airline's embossed logo was printed inside. Below it, the name and title stared back at her like a death sentence. CEO and Chairman of the Board. The blood drained from her face. The CEO didn't say a word. He simply watched her reaction, his expression cool and composed. The woman's knees nearly buckled. Passengers who had been enjoying the show now looked deeply uncomfortable. Some exchanged wide-eyed glances, while others averted their gazes, pretending not to see what was happening. The younger flight attendant opened her mouth, but no sound came out. The realization had hit her like a truck. The man she had just humiliated in front of everyone was her boss's boss's boss. And she had just made the biggest mistake of her career. But the real consequences were only just beginning. The cabin was dead silent. The younger flight attendant stood frozen, her breath shallow, her face a shade paler than before. She had embarrassed, accused, and nearly ejected the CEO, the most powerful man in the airline. And now, he was sitting there, watching her reaction unfold without saying a single word. Passengers who had initially been amused were now stiff with second-hand embarrassment. A man who had been smirking earlier now adjusted his tie awkwardly. A woman who had been quietly enjoying the exchange now pretended to be deeply interested in the in-flight menu. The senior flight attendant remained still, but her hands were clenched at her sides. And the captain, who had remained neutral this entire time, finally spoke. "Is there an issue, sir?" His voice was carefully measured, but everyone could hear the shift in his tone. The CEO glanced at him, just for a second, before turning his gaze back to the flight attendant who had humiliated him. "I believe," he said smoothly, "I was just asked to leave my seat." The woman flinched. She finally understood the gravity of what she had done. She had treated him like a fraud. A trespasser. A problem to be handled. And yet, he had never once fought back. He had simply let her dig her own grave. The captain's lips tightened. "That won't be necessary," he said. He shot a pointed look at the younger flight attendant, who was now visibly shaking. I didn't know," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "Didn't know?" The CEO's voice was deceptively calm. "Or didn't care?" Her breath hitched. Passengers shifted in their seats, their interest in the situation suddenly turning into unease. They had laughed. They had enjoyed the scene. And now? Now it wasn't funny anymore. The CEO adjusted his jacket, his expression unreadable. "Tell me," he continued, his voice slow, deliberate. "Did you question anyone else's ticket today?" The flight attendant's lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. Because the answer was no. She hadn't questioned anyone else. She had seen a man who didn't look like the usual first-class passenger, and she had assumed he didn't belong. The realization hit like a brick wall. Her eyes darted to the senior flight attendant, desperate for help. But the older woman didn't move. She simply stood there, watching. This was her mistake to own. The CEO exhaled softly, shaking his head once. "Interesting," he murmured. He reached for his boarding pass, taking it back from the senior attendant, and placed it neatly into his pocket. Then, without another word, he leaned back into his seat and closed his eyes. The conversation was over. At least for now. The younger flight attendant hesitated, lingering in the aisle as though expecting someone to rescue her from the consequences. No one did. Passengers returned to their seats, pretending as if they weren't hyper-aware of the tension still crackling in the air. The captain nodded once at the CEO, then turned and walked back to the cockpit. And the senior flight attendant gave the younger one a single, final glance, one filled with quiet disappointment, before stepping away. Leaving her standing there. Alone. A flight attendant who had once been so sure of herself, so confident in her judgment, now stood in the middle of first class, drowning in the weight of what she had done. And the flight hadn't even taken off yet. But she had no idea what was still coming. The flight had taken off, but the tension in first class hadn't lifted. The younger flight attendant moved mechanically, avoiding eye contact with passengers. Whispers buzzed around the cabin, hushed but unmistakable. She had humiliated the CEO in front of everyone. And now? Now, every step she took felt like walking through fire. Meanwhile, the CEO sat completely still, gazing out the window at the sky stretching endlessly ahead. He hadn't said another word since their confrontation. He didn't need to. But his silence was louder than anything else in the room. The senior flight attendant discreetly approached him, standing beside his seat. "Sir," she started, her voice carefully neutral. The CEO tilted his head slightly, acknowledging her presence but saying nothing. She swallowed. She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I deeply apologize for what happened earlier. It should never have occurred." A pause. Then, without looking at her, the CEO responded, calmly, smoothly, with unsettling patience. "Do you know why I didn't say anything?" The senior attendant blinked. "Sir?" "When she accused me of being in the wrong seat," he continued, his voice quiet but razor-sharp, "why do you think I didn't correct her?" The senior flight attendant didn't know how to answer. She glanced toward the younger flight attendant, who was currently at the front of the cabin, stiffly pouring champagne for a businessman. Her hands shook slightly, her usual arrogance replaced by an unmistakable sense of dread. The CEO watched her too, his gaze unreadable. Finally, he turned back to the senior attendant. "She's not the only one who made assumptions today," he said. The senior attendant's stomach dropped. Because he was right. The passengers. The other crew members. Even herself. They had all assumed things based on appearances. And now, everyone was learning the cost of that mistake. The CEO exhaled softly, stretching his fingers along the armrest. "I've flown my own airline many times," he said. "I do it quietly. Unnoticed." His lips curled slightly, though it wasn't quite a smile. It's always interesting to see how different people are treated when no one knows who they are. The senior attendant lowered her gaze, guilt pressing against her chest. The CEO let the silence linger for a moment longer before saying, "I'm not interested in an apology." She snapped her head up, startled. "I'm interested in change." His voice carried a weight that sent a chill down her spine. And with that, he dismissed her with a single glance. At the front of the cabin, the younger flight attendant was crumbling. Her hands trembled as she poured a drink, nearly spilling it onto a passenger's lap. The businessman scoffed, irritated. "Get it together," he muttered under his breath. She bit her lip hard, blinking rapidly. Everything felt different now. The same passengers who had laughed along with her earlier now avoided her gaze. The same first-class cabin where she once felt in control now felt claustrophobic. She had built her entire persona on power, authority, and confidence, but one mistake had shattered it all. She tried to take a deep breath, but her mind raced. What's going to happen to me? Will I lose my job? Will he fire me right here, mid-flight? She dared to glance toward the CEO's seat. He wasn't looking at her. He hadn't acknowledged her once since the confrontation. And somehow, that was even worse than if he had. She felt the weight of something far greater than embarrassment. Regret. And the worst part? The flight was still hours away from landing. But what she didn't know was that the real test was only beginning. The CEO wasn't done yet. And by the time they reached their destination, this flight would change her forever. The cabin lights dimmed as the plane cruised at 35,000 feet, but the tension in first class remained suffocating. The younger flight attendant moved like a shadow, barely speaking, her movements stiff and mechanical. The once arrogant confidence she carried earlier had vanished completely. Passengers who had chuckled at her comments earlier were now avoiding eye contact. The same people who had been entertained by the spectacle were now pretending they hadn't witnessed anything at all. Because now, everyone knew the truth. The man she had humiliated was the CEO of the airline. And he hadn't forgotten. At 30 minutes into the flight, turbulence hit. The plane lurched suddenly, jolting the passengers in their seats. A few gasps filled the cabin as the seatbelt sign flickered on, and the captain's voice came over the intercom, "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some unexpected turbulence. Please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts." The younger flight attendant rushed to secure the drink cart, but her hands were shaking so badly that she knocked over a glass of champagne, sending golden liquid splashing across the floor. Passengers groaned, and she muttered a curse under her breath, bending down to clean it. From his seat, the CEO watched. Not with anger. Not with amusement. Just silent observation. And that silence made her nervous beyond words. She couldn't tell what he was thinking, and that made it worse. Was he waiting for the right moment to humiliate her in return? Was he going to fire her right here, in front of everyone? Her mind spiraled, but before she could think further, the turbulence worsened. A violent shake sent a tray of utensils crashing to the floor, and the overhead compartments rattled aggressively. A woman in the first row let out a frightened gasp, gripping her husband's arm. The plane dipped slightly, and panic spread like wildfire through the cabin. And then, a sudden cry. Help! A passenger, an elderly man, clutched his chest, his face twisted in pain. His wife shouted for assistance, her voice desperate. The younger flight attendant froze. Her mind went blank. She had trained for emergencies, but right now, fear had her paralyzed. She didn't move. She didn't react. She just stood there, useless. And then, he moved. The CEO rose from his seat, stepping forward calmly, efficiently. Without hesitation, he knelt beside the elderly man, loosening his tie, checking his pulse with steady hands. Breathe slowly, he instructed, his voice firm but gentle. Can you tell me what you're feeling? The old man's chest heaved unevenly, but he nodded weakly. Pain, in my chest, it's tightening. The CEO turned to the younger flight attendant, his eyes sharp. Bring me the medical kit. Now. She snapped out of her frozen state, scrambling toward the storage compartment. Her hands shook violently as she retrieved the kit, nearly dropping it on the way back. The CEO took it smoothly, opening it with practiced ease. He wasn't just a businessman, he was a trained first responder, a skill he had picked up from years of managing emergency airline operations. He worked with precision, instructing the senior flight attendant to alert the pilot. We need priority landing, he ordered. Tell them to contact medics on the ground. The senior attendant obeyed instantly. Meanwhile, the younger flight attendant stood there, watching in stunned silence. Because at this moment, she realized something devastating. The man she had insulted, humiliated, and disrespected, was now saving a life. And she? She had frozen. She had failed. Shame burned her from the inside out, but there was no time to dwell on it. Because the flight wasn't over yet. And the real lesson hadn't even begun. The cabin remained tense as the CEO continued assisting the elderly man. His movements were steady, precise, his voice calm despite the urgency of the situation. Just breathe, he instructed, loosening the man's collar. You're not alone. The older man clutched his chest, his breathing uneven. His wife held onto his arm, tears in her eyes. Meanwhile, the younger flight attendant stood frozen, watching as the man she had insulted and humiliated was now the only one in control. She should have been handling this. She should have known what to do. But instead, she had completely fallen apart, and now, in front of passengers, crew, and the CEO himself, her incompetence was on full display. The senior flight attendant returned from the cockpit. Sir, the captain has arranged for an emergency medical team upon landing. They're preparing a stretcher. The CEO nodded, never taking his eyes off the elderly man. Good. We'll keep him stabilized until then. Passengers watched in stunned silence, witnessing something they would never have believed if they hadn't seen it for themselves. Because in this moment, the CEO wasn't just a businessman. He was a leader. And then, he looked up. His calm, piercing gaze locked onto the younger flight attendant. She felt her stomach drop. Water, he said, his tone neutral. He needs water. She snapped out of her paralysis, rushing to grab a bottle, but her hands were still shaking. When she returned, she tried to twist the cap open, but her fingers fumbled. The CEO reached out, took the bottle from her without a word, and smoothly opened it himself. The gesture was small, but it spoke volumes. It wasn't just about the water. It was a silent statement. I don't trust you to handle this. She swallowed hard, her face burning with shame. The CEO helped the elderly man sip the water, speaking to him in a soothing tone. Meanwhile, the younger flight attendant shrank back, feeling smaller than she ever had in her life. The reality was crystal clear now. She had been so obsessed with status that she had failed at the one thing that truly mattered in her job, taking care of people. And now, everyone could see it. Minutes later, final descent. The pilot's voice came over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our descent. Emergency services will be on standby once we land. The elderly man's breathing had stabilized, thanks to the CEO's calm leadership. The younger flight attendant hadn't said a word since her failure was exposed. She was dreading what would happen next. Would the CEO call her out in front of everyone? Would she be fired the moment they landed? Would he humiliate her the way she had humiliated him? But he never even looked at her again. And somehow, that was worse. Landing, the unspoken judgment. The moment the plane touched down, paramedics rushed aboard. The elderly man was carefully carried out, his wife thanking the CEO with tears in her eyes. Passengers gathered their belongings, still buzzing from what had happened. The younger flight attendant stood near the exit, her knees weak, her heart pounding. Any second now, the CEO would report her. Any second now, she would be fired. The CEO stood, adjusting his jacket, giving one last glance at the first-class cabin. Then, with measured steps, he walked past her without a word. Not a single glance. Not a single reprimand. Not even a single look of disappointment. He simply left. And somehow, that silence cut deeper than anything else could have. Because he didn't need to punish her. She already knew exactly what she had done. And she would never forget it. But what she didn't know was that the CEO wasn't done with her yet. The real lesson was still coming. And it would be unlike anything she had ever expected. The younger flight attendant stood at the gate, watching as passengers filed out of the plane, each step making her heart hammer harder. The CEO had left without a word, and that silence felt like a death sentence. Her career was over. She knew it. Everyone had seen what happened, the way she humiliated him, the way she froze during an emergency, the way she let someone else step in and do her job. And now? She was waiting for the call. The one that would tell her she was done. Back in the airline office, hours later, the younger flight attendant sat stiffly in a chair, her hands clasped together so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The CEO was in the room, seated behind a sleek, imposing desk. His expression? Unreadable. The HR director sat next to him, flipping through a folder. "We've received reports about today's incident," she said carefully. "It appears that you, I know," the flight attendant blurted. Her voice cracked. I messed up." The CEO remained silent. Watching. Studying. She swallowed hard. "I humiliated a passenger," she hesitated, correcting herself. "I humiliated you." Silence. She glanced up, but his expression didn't change. And then, when things got serious, she continued, voice barely above a whisper, I wasn't prepared. I froze. And you," she exhaled shakily, "you saved him. You did my job better than I did." Still, the CEO didn't speak. His silence was crushing. She clenched her fists. "I know I deserve to be fired." Finally, the CEO leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "Why do you think I called you here?" he asked, his voice calm. She blinked. To fire me?" For the first time, something flickered in his gaze, something unexpected. "I don't fire people for making mistakes," he said. "I fire people who don't learn from them." Her breath caught in her throat. Then, he folded his hands together, his tone turning sharper. "You were so focused on status," he said, "that you failed at the one thing that actually matters in your job." She swallowed hard, shame burning through her. He continued. "You thought respect was something that only applied to people you believed deserved it." He shook his head. "You forgot that real respect isn't about who someone is, it's about how you treat people when you think they're unimportant." She felt her chest tighten. Because he was right. And there was nothing she could say to defend herself. The unexpected offer, she braced herself. Any second now, he would tell her to clean out her locker, hand over her badge, and never step foot on one of his planes again. Instead, he did something she never expected. "I'm not firing you," he said. Her head snapped up in shock. The HR director raised an eyebrow but said nothing. The CEO's eyes stayed locked on hers. "But you're not going back to first class, either." A cold feeling settled in her stomach. "You're being reassigned," he continued. "For the next 6 months, you'll be working exclusively in economy class." Her mouth went dry. Economy? She had spent her career looking down on economy class passengers, now she was being forced to serve them? "This isn't punishment," the CEO clarified. "It's a chance. A chance to understand that your job isn't about status, or exclusivity, or appearances. It's about people." She clenched her hands in her lap, humiliation burning in her chest. "Do you think that's unfair?" he asked, watching her closely. She opened her mouth to protest, then stopped. Because the truth was, it wasn't unfair at all. It was exactly what she deserved. She exhaled shakily and nodded. "No, sir," she said, her voice small. "I understand." The CEO studied her for a moment longer, then nodded once. "Good." Then, with a final glance, he stood up. The meeting was over. But her lesson had only just begun. Final scene: 1 month later, the flight attendant adjusted her uniform, standing near the back of the plane. She was in economy class now. Not in first. Not where the luxury was. Not where the important people were. But for the first time, she saw things differently. A woman struggling to settle her child into a seat. A tired construction worker rubbing his temples after a long shift. An elderly couple, their hands intertwined, laughing over something small and sweet. These weren't just passengers. They were people. She took a deep breath. And then, as a new passenger boarded, she greeted him with a genuine smile. For the first time, she truly understood what her job was about. And she was finally ready to do it right. The hum of the plane's engines filled the economy cabin. The flight attendant, once so obsessed with first class and status, stood near the aisle, watching passengers board. Everything felt different now. She had spent the last month in economy class, learning firsthand what she had ignored for so long. Before, she had barely noticed these passengers. Now, she saw them for who they really were. A tired single mother, struggling to lift her carry-on into the overhead bin while holding a fussy toddler. A young soldier, heading home for the first time in over a year, eyes scanning the crowd for familiar faces. An elderly woman, fumbling with her seatbelt, her hands shaking slightly with age. These weren't just names on a flight manifest. They were people. And for the first time, she realized how much she had overlooked. The true test begins as she moved down the aisle, assisting passengers. A familiar voice made her stop in her tracks. "I think I'll need some water when we take off." Her breath hitched. She turned her head, and her heart nearly stopped. Seated near the window, in the middle of economy class, was him. The CEO. Her throat went dry. She hadn't seen him since their meeting in the airline office. Hadn't spoken to him. Hadn't even expected to cross paths again. But now? Here he was, sitting casually, as if this were any other flight. As if he hadn't completely shattered her perception of her job just a few weeks ago. He didn't look at her. Didn't acknowledge her presence. He simply adjusted his watch and gazed out the window, waiting for takeoff. Her palms were sweaty. Was this another test? She took a deep breath, steadied herself, and forced her voice to remain professional. "I'll bring it as soon as we're in the air, sir." The CEO tilted his head slightly at her response. Then, for the first time, he looked directly at her. She braced herself. But his expression was impossible to read. A small nod. Nothing more. And then, he turned back to the window, saying nothing else. Her legs felt weak, but she pushed forward, continuing her duties. Mid-flight, the defining moment the seatbelt sign flickered off. Passengers settled in. Some dozed off, while others watched movies or read books. She walked toward the CEO's row, carrying a bottle of water and a neatly folded napkin. As she approached, she felt every muscle in her body tense. Would he say something? Would he bring up the past? Would he tell her, right here and now, that her second chance was over? Instead, as she set the water down on his tray table, he did something unexpected. He picked up the napkin. Unfolded it. She frowned. She hadn't written anything on it, had she? No. It was blank. She glanced at his expression, confused. But then, he did something even stranger. He reached into his inside jacket pocket, and pulled out a pen. Then, in neat, calculated strokes, he wrote something. After a moment, he folded the napkin back and placed it beside his water. Then, as she stood there, he slid it toward her. Her pulse pounded in her ears. Slowly, she picked it up, unfolding it with trembling fingers. And then, she read the words. You've improved. Keep going. Her breath caught in her throat. A rush of emotion swelled in her chest. Not relief. Not just gratitude. But something deeper. Something she had never expected to feel from this man. Respect. She clutched the napkin in her hands, nodding once. Thank you, sir, she whispered. The CEO didn't smile. Didn't offer words of encouragement. He simply nodded, taking a sip of his water. And just like that, the lesson was over. Final descent, a new beginning. As the plane began its descent, she realized something. She had spent so much of her life believing respect was earned by power, wealth, and appearances. But in reality? It was earned by actions, growth, and change. The CEO had taught her that without a single lecture. Without a single act of revenge. And now, she would never forget it. Because this flight had changed her forever.